Good construction contracts are essential for project owners who wish to complete their projects on schedule. The content of a contract is critical when we're talking about deadlines and matters of schedule. And it isn't just the completion deadline that is important, but also some of the other information that would be written down in the construction contract, but also some of the realities that need to exist, in the field, when owners, wish to move into their home reasonably close to the time that they were hoping. I can't tell you how many times, people will reach out to me as a construction lawyer. They're in the middle of a project and they'll say, my contractor's late, I'm unhappy, I want to bring a claim, or I want to get rid of them, or, I want you to do something to accelerate their work. And I'll take a look at the contract, and usually it's not a thoughtful construction contract with detailed terms around schedule. Usually it's just a piece of paper that the contractor gave to the homeowner to sign, and more times than not, there are no dates or deadlines on there at all. And so, when that happens, I'm in the uncomfortable position of having to tell the homeowner, there's nothing in here at all about, what the completion deadline is. And so there is no completion deadline. You're not allowed, to go to a court or an arbitrator and say that the contractor's late because you've decided to enter into a business deal where the completion date is not one of the key terms. A homeowner that expects a court or an arbitrator to just sort of, insert their own judgment about what a reasonable time frame to complete the project is for the contractor are going to be very disappointed, because that's not, what the judges or the arbitrators that resolve construction disputes do. They do not worship at the altar of justice. They worship at the altar of predictability. And if there is no completion deadline in a construction contract, then it's almost impossible for the contractor to be late. I mean, even if you want to get into the absurd, if it takes a couple years longer than the homeowner was expecting, if there isn't, a thoughtful explanation of what the schedule is and how, the different phases of work will be scheduled, in a certain sequence that when you stack it together, it leads to a completion deadline. A homeowner is going to be disappointed to learn essentially that a contractor doesn't have a completion deadline, and even if you have a construction contract that does have a completion deadline, a lot of times the date or the deadline on the paper, isn't worth the paper that it's written on if there are things that are happening on the project that are outside the control of the contractor or would make it reasonable for the contractor to require more time. I mean, this is a huge oversimplification, but, on every construction project, there are buckets of responsibility. There are things that the contractor needs to do, and there are things that, the architects and engineers who are designing the project need to do, and there are certain actions that owners need to do in terms of making decisions, securing financing, and there are others as well. There are timeframes that an owner is responsible for in terms of, getting the local government that issues permits to, act reasonably promptly. And whenever there's a delay that falls outside the bucket of the contractor's responsibility, even if there's a completion deadline in whatever piece of paper you signed, with the contractor at the beginning of the project, even if you do have a written contract and it does say the contractor is going to be complete on this date, there's no court or arbitrator that is going to, hold the contractor to, an impossibly short deadline that was rendered impossible because other parties didn't perform properly or were slow. And so, what you need to have if you're a project owner, if you're going to write a good construction contract that is going to give you a chance of completing your project on schedule, it's more than just a completion deadline. You need a realistic plan, bearing in mind who are all the parties that have to, work together to complete the project. What are their tasks? What falls in each's bucket of responsibility? And what do we need to do to make sure that the reality on the ground with the project, is such that it would put the contractor in a position of being able to do their thing within a certain time frame and to hit the original schedule, the original deadline that the homeowner was hoping to achieve. So you need to make sure that the facts on the ground are good, that there's like a realistic plan for all of the project participants to do their thing, and it all needs to be in compliance with Illinois law and tidied up in a good contract that doesn't just have a completion date for the contractor, but has a much more detailed explanation of what are all the tasks and what is the kind of critical path of the work, and how is the homeowner going to take care of the things that they're responsible for. If they've hired the architect and the engineer that's doing the drawings, and the specifications, like how is the owner going to make sure that they've kind of cleared the path for that work to happen, in an appropriate time frame, and how are they going to be able to get the permits that they need and the other approvals from the local government agency, and then put the contractor in a position, to do their thing, to hit a certain completion deadline. If you don't have, those realities on the ground and a reasonable plan, and an understanding of the way that everything's going to happen in sequence, bundled up into a reasonable construction contract, it doesn't matter, whether the contractor a year or two ago gave you a completion deadline. It's going to be very easy for them to be able to convince a judge or an arbitrator that it would be inequitable to hold them to a deadline that was blown for reasons that are not their responsibility. So, the content of the contract is critical. There's other things that are critical, but if you are a project owner, okay, and you have any hope of completing your project on time, which can be really important. It might be necessary to move in at a certain point so your kids can start school. If you've got any hope of being in your new home, inside your new project at a certain deadline, you need to have a bunch of things, including a good construction contract, and it has to go more than just go beyond just stating a deadline for the contractor to complete their work.